On the 23rd day of April 1642, the governor of a northern port town refused entry to the reigning monarch of England. King Charles III stood outside the gates of Hull, whilst the man he had appointed days earlier held the city against him. Within months the English Civil War had begun, and Hull, a modest trading settlement on the estuary of the Humber, found itself at the centre of the conflict that would reshape the nation. The images you are about to see reconstruct this city's past through artificial intelligence, interpreting historical records, maps, and archaeological evidence. Small inconsistencies may appear, but these tools allow us to visualize places and moments that no camera could otherwise capture. This is the story of Hull, from its 12th century foundation as Wyke, a monastic wool port, through its transformation into Kingstown upon Hull under Edward I. We follow its defiance in the Civil War, its role as birthplace of William Wilberforce and the abolition movement, its ascent as a whaling and fishing capital, its devastation in the Second World War under a code name that erased it from public record, and its long struggle through decline to a 21st century cultural rebirth. 8 centuries of a city that changed Britain then disappeared from memory. 4 decades before that refusal at the gates, the settlement that would become Hull existed only as a remote huddle of timber structures on waterlogged ground where the River Hull met the Humber estuary. Contemporary records describe the site as lacking fresh water and vulnerable to tidal flooding, yet the confluence offered what monks of Mayo Abbey had sought, an excellent natural haven for shipping wool to continental markets. They named their new port Wyke, derived most likely from the Scandinavian word for inlet, and by the closing decades of the 12th century, vessels loaded with fleeces from Yorkshire's prosperous hinterlands were departing regularly for the Low Countries and Baltic ports. The monastic enterprise attracted royal attention. In 1293, King Edward I of Arces acquired Wyke from the abbey, recognising its strategic value as he prepared campaigns against Scotland. 6 years later, on the 1st of April 1299, a royal charter renamed the settlement Kingstown upon Hull, and the document preserved today in the Guildhall archives marks the formal birth of what would become England's foremost port on the eastern coast. Edward used the town as his military base throughout the First War of Scottish independence, and ships that had carried wool now provisioned armies marching north. Trade flourished in the wake of royal patronage. By the early 14th century, Hull's wharves received timber and wine from the Baltic, whilst exporting woolen cloth to Hanseatic League ports, establishing commercial networks that stretched from Scotland and Scandinavia to France, Spain, and Portugal. The prosperity generated by this traffic manifested in stone and brick. Holy Trinity Church, begun in the early 1300s, grew to become one of England's largest parish churches by area, its brick construction reflecting both wealth and continental building techniques arriving through maritime contact. Rare for the period, brick fortifications encircled the expanding town, marking Hull as a strategically fortified royal possession rather than merely a merchant settlement. By 1440, Hull was granted the status of a county corporate, with its own sheriff and alderman. A century earlier, the wool merchant Sir William de la Pole had served as the town's first mayor, founding a family whose influence would shape national politics for generations. When 1500 arrived, Hull's population had reached approximately 3,000 souls, and the waterlogged inlet, once known as Wyke, had transformed into a thriving commercial hub whose allegiances to trade, to autonomy, to strategic importance would one day matter more than any king standing at its gates. The transformation Henry VIII had ordered in the late 1530s bore fruit 2 years later when the king himself arrived at Hull in July 1540 to inspect the new fortifications. Contemporary accounts describe the royal progress along brick walls still giving off the chalky dust of fresh mortar, past the blockhouses positioned to command the Humber approaches with cannon. The king stayed 5 days, noting with satisfaction the expanded arsenal that now held munitions for the entire northern frontier, powder stores, pike racks, cannon foundries, rope walks for naval cordage stretching the length of the town. What Henry built as a defensive stronghold would become, within a century, the spark that ignited constitutional revolution. On the 23rd of April, 1642, King Charles I rode to Hull's Beverley Gate, expecting the arsenal within to supply his campaign against parliamentary opposition. Sir John Hotham stood on those same Tudor walls and refused entry to his sovereign. The governor, appointed by Parliament 11 weeks earlier in direct challenge to the King's nomination of the Earl of Newcastle, declared the magazine secured for parliamentary authority. Charles withdrew to nearby Beverley, then returned with forces to besiege the town that had closed its gates against him. That public rejection of royal prerogative, enacted on brick ramparts built by Henry to defend the realm, became the acknowledged trigger of open conflict between Crown and Parliament. Hull endured 2 sieges over the following 18 months, whilst the arsenal within armed parliamentary forces across the north. The defences Henry had commissioned held firm against royalist batteries. Records from the sieges detailed the sound of continuous bombardment echoing across the marshland approaches, the acrid residue of burnt powder settling over rooftops, the rhythm of garrison life measured by watches and rations as supplies arrived by sea through the Parliamentary Navy's control of the Humber. The town that had grown prosperous through continental wool trade now sustained itself as an island fortress, its quays receiving munitions, whilst the countryside beyond the walls turned royalist. Sir John Hotham, the governor whose refusal had precipitated civil war, was executed by Parliament for treason within 2 years, suspected of negotiating with the enemy he had first defied. Hull itself remained parliamentary throughout the conflict, the arsenal never falling to royalist hands. The house on High Street, where William Wilberforce was born on the 24th of August 1759, still stands in Hull today, preserved as a museum within the stone and brick fabric of the Georgian merchant quarter. Contemporary accounts describe these terraced residences as places of measured prosperity, where wool traders and ship owners conducted business in ground floor counting houses, whilst families occupied the floors above. The Wilberforces belonged to this mercantile class, their wealth drawn from Baltic trade rather than the triangular routes that enriched Liverpool and Bristol through human cargo. Records show that young Wilberforce entered Parliament as Hull's representative in 1780. Aged just 21, his early speeches noted more for wit than conviction. The transformation came 5 years later when evangelical conversion redirected the course of his public life. From 1787 onwards, he became the parliamentary voice of the abolition movement, standing against economic interests so colossal that the sugar colonies alone were valued at £70 million sterling, more than the entire annual revenue of the British state. For 2 decades, Wilberforce introduced anti-slave trade legislation with methodical persistence, each bill defeated by coalitions representing Liverpool's slave merchants, Bristol's sugar refiners, and London's banking houses that financed the voyages. Contemporary parliamentary records document the opposition's arguments that abolition would destroy British commerce, that France would simply claim the trade, that slavery itself was sanctioned by scripture and natural order. Against this, Wilberforce marshalled evidence gathered by Thomas Clarkson and the Abolition Committee, accounts of conditions aboard the Middle Passage vessels that even sympathetic members struggled to hear recounted in the chamber. The turning came in 1807 when the Slave Trade Act passed both houses, banning British participation in the traffic of enslaved Africans across the Atlantic. Yet the institution of slavery itself remained legal throughout the empire's sugar islands and beyond. Wilberforce continued his work through declining health, supported by younger abolitionists who had taken up the cause. The final Slavery Abolition Act received royal assent on the 28th of July 1833. 3 days later, William Wilberforce died at his cousin's house in London, the news of emancipation having reached him in his final conscious hours. Hull's particular legacy rests in this documented fact. The port that never enriched itself through the slave trade produced the man whose life's work ended it. The moral architecture of that achievement stands independent of Hull's later industrial fortunes, a singular contribution to British history built not from maritime wealth, but from persistent conviction carried forward through 46 years of parliamentary labour. If this journey through Hull's past resonates with you, consider becoming a channel member. Your support helps me keep rebuilding lost cities, frame by frame. The docks that had handled wool and wine since medieval times took on a more brutal commerce in the middle decades of the 18th century, when Hull's shipyards began fitting vessels for the Arctic whale fishery. Contemporary records describe the distinctive outline of whaling ships at the town's quays. Reinforced hulls, sheathed in oak planking 2 feet thick, bows plated with iron to withstand the grinding pressure of northern ice. Each spring from 1750 onwards, these fleets sailed beyond the Shetland Isles towards the hunting grounds off Greenland and Spitsbergen, returning months later with holds full of blubber rendered down in trypots aboard ship, the entire vessel reeking of whale oil and charred fat, a smell noted by every contemporary account of the town's waterfront during the season. That oil lit the lamps and lubricated the machinery of industrial Britain. Hull became England's principal whaling port by the turn of the 19th century, with dozens of vessels departing each year into waters where pack ice could close around a ship's hull in hours, crushing timber and iron as if they were kindling. Lloyd's of London registers from the period document the losses: vessels never returned, crews frozen in their hammocks, ships abandoned amongst the floes, with all hands attempting the march south across the ice. The trade sustained families throughout HES Ewell Road and the streets near the docks for 3 generations before the whale populations gave out and cheaper petroleum oils replaced the Arctic harvest. What followed was not decline, but reinvention. By the final decades of the 19th century, Hull's shipowners had turned from whaling to distant water trawling, sending steam-powered vessels to Iceland, the Barents Sea, and the fishing grounds off Greenland, where their grandfathers had hunted whales. The port grew into one of the world's largest fishing centres, with hundreds of trawlers operating from the docks, and thousands of tons of cod and haddock landed each week to feed the industrial cities of the Midlands and the North. The community that sustained this new industry centred on HAS Ewell Road, where the families of trawlermen developed patterns documented throughout the first half of the 20th century, women managing households and finances whilst their husbands spent 3 weeks at sea, followed by 3 days ashore, a cycle that shaped every aspect of daily life. Contemporary social surveys describe a culture of mutual support amongst neighbours, of credit extended by shopkeepers who knew which vessels had sailed, of children raised in streets where almost every father worked the distant waters. Hull's maritime identity, forged first in whale oil and Arctic ice, had found new expression in salt and fish. The first bombs fell on Hull in June 1940, shortly after midnight on the 18th, when German aircraft returning from raids deeper into England found the port city and its docks spread beneath them along the dark estuary of the Humber. The location that had made Hull a prosperous medieval harbour now rendered it catastrophically vulnerable, an accessible target on the eastern coast, impossible to miss for bombers navigating home across the North Sea. Contemporary accounts describe the sound of aircraft engines becoming a nightly familiarity throughout the summer and autumn months, the wail of sirens punctuating the darkness with increasing frequency as the bombing campaign intensified. The worst raids came in 1941. Night after night, incendiary devices and high explosive bombs descended upon the docks, the railway yards, the industrial facilities along the river, and the densely packed streets of terraced housing that surrounded them. By the time the war ended in 1945, official records documented over 1,200 deaths and approximately 3,000 injured. More than 95% of the city's houses had sustained damage or been destroyed outright, a level of devastation that made Hull Britain's second most bombed city by building destruction after London. At various points during the conflict, some 152,000 people amongst Hull's population of roughly 320,000 found themselves homeless, sheltering where they could whilst their streets burned. Yet the nation never knew. Wartime censorship forbade newspapers and radio broadcasts from naming Hull in reports of bombing raids. Press accounts referred only to a northeast town or a northeast coastal town, vague designations that concealed the identity of the suffering city from the British public. Contemporary residents documented the peculiar isolation this erasure created, experiencing devastation on a scale comparable to the Blitz of London, whilst remaining anonymous in the national consciousness, their city's martyrdom unacknowledged beyond the Humber estuary. The physical reconstruction began slowly after 1945. Bomb sites and vacant lots marked the cityscape for decades. scars that persisted long after the rubble had been cleared. Photographs from the 1950s and 60s show gaps in terraced rows where houses once stood, empty spaces amongst the rebuilt streets. The wartime censorship that had kept Hull nameless during its destruction became a lasting erasure. The Forgotten Blitz of the Forgotten Port, its suffering documented in archives but absent from the popular memory of the Second World War. The trawlers that returned to Hull in the decade after 1945 brought catches larger than the port had ever known. The distant water fleet numbered more than 100 vessels by the late 1950s, each capable of working Arctic grounds for 3 weeks or more before steaming south with holds packed in ice. Contemporary accounts describe St Andrew's Dock at the height of this boom as a realm of perpetual activity. Crews unloading at all hours, fish merchants moving through auction halls still slick from the morning's trade, and the acrid diesel exhaust from trawler engines mixing with the salt-heavy air off the Humber. Iceland's first extension of territorial waters to 12 miles in 1958 met immediate resistance. British trawlers continued fishing grounds their crews had worked for generations, whilst Icelandic Coast Guard vessels harassed them with water cannon and wire-cutting equipment designed to sever trawl nets. The Royal Navy dispatched frigates to protect Hull's fleet, and for months the waters off Iceland witnessed a peculiar confrontation, fishing vessels manoeuvring between Coast Guard cutters whilst naval escorts stood by. A Cold War fought with paint-scraping collisions and severed cables rather than gunfire. The 18th of February 1968 brought catastrophe of a different order. The trawler St. Romanus vanished in Arctic waters with 20 men aboard. Within 3 weeks, 2 more Hull vessels, Kingston Peridot and Ross Cleveland, went down in the same frozen seas. 58 men perished in total, and the city's fishing families knew, before official word arrived, that something had broken. Women gathered outside the trawler owners' offices on HHSUL Road, and amongst them Lillian Beloka began demanding what contemporary newspaper accounts described as revolutionary safety reforms: radio operators on every vessel, restrictions on winter fishing, proper life-saving equipment as standard. The headscarf revolutionaries, as the press termed them, forced changes that owners had resisted for decades. But Iceland's final extension to 200 miles in 1975 closed the most productive Arctic grounds entirely. The Third Cod War ended in 76, with British access lost, and Hull's distant water fleet began its terminal decline. Within a decade, St Andrew's Dock stood nearly empty. Thousands of jobs vanished from HSUL Road, where entire streets had once depended on the trawler's return. The maritime soul that had defined the port since medieval wool traders first sailed from Wyke was disappearing, and Hull faced an economic collapse from which it would not recover for generations. The Humber Bridge that opened in 1981 stretched a single span of 4,626 feet across the estuary, the longest suspension bridge of its kind until '98. Contemporary accounts describe the view from midspan on clear mornings, when both riverbanks appeared as thin lines against water and sky, and the port city itself became a pattern of rooftops and church towers, diminishing towards the confluence where monks had first driven timber piles into waterlogged ground 8 centuries before. Philip Larkin, who served as university librarian for 30 years until his death in '85, chronicled Hull in verse as a place at the end of the line, where England ran out into the North Sea and the long history of arrivals and departures settled into memory. The deep aquarium that opened in 2002 brought 3,000 species to tanks built on land the trawlers once knew. When Hull received the City of Culture designation in 2017, the Ferrens Art Gallery hosted the Turner Prize, whilst 25,000 gathered for festival nights along streets that had stood empty after the fishing fleet's demise. Wilberforce House remains on High Street, memorial to chains broken and distances crossed. The town that closed its gates to a king found its voice again at the river's meeting, where the tide still turns twice daily as it always has.